we'll go ahead and get started. First want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. I know it's brutally cold out there. We considered maybe rescheduling this evening, but we had sent out probably 1,100 different mailings advertising the workshops, and we thought for those that showed up, probably worse for them to be turned away. So tonight is the first of what will be 3 community workshops on the downtown zoning update. We tried to kind of change them up a little bit, so each night will not be the same format. Tonight we were really focused on how the business community would be interested in the downtown zoning update. So that'll be probably the main focus of the presentation. But certainly if you have questions in other areas, we can address those as well. Just some introductions. I'm Dave DeGroot. I'm the Community Development Director with the city. Presenting with me this evening is Con Savoy from Tesca Associates. He's the consultant that's been working with us on this project for really a couple of years now. And we'll get into a little bit of explanation on why it's taken some time to get to this stage. So Con will go over a summary of the downtown station area master plan, which was really the impetus for this zoning update. He will go over a review of the project objectives, update us on the status of the project, and then provide a summary of the focus group discussions that were done a few years back as part of this project. And then I'll go over some of the barriers and conflicts that we have in our existing zoning ordinance. I will go over some of the recommended changes of the ordinance, provide a review of the zoning analysis and kind of how we determine what properties would be zoned what with this update, and then review our non-conforming provisions. So if there's a change that's being suggested for a piece of property that makes your property non-conforming, what does that mean and what are your options moving forward? There is a sign-in sheet by the front door. You don't have to sign in, but we're offering that. If you have questions or would like a follow-up phone call, please provide your name, address, email, phone, and let us know, and we can reach out to you and follow up with you. So with that, Con, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I apologize up front. I'm nursing a cold. That's why you see me over there nursing my tea. So hopefully my voice will hang in there and not cough too much in your ear. I have had the privilege to have worked with David and the community several on this project now dating back, probably we started this project initially back in 2014. In fact, many of you now representing the business community may have participated with me and some of my other colleagues in some of the initial sessions we had where we reached out to business and property owners to get their ideas as to what was broken, what they would like to see fixed with regard to how the current zoning ordinance did or did not basically allow them to be successful. And so tonight is the culmination of that. It's been a long road for various different reasons, but suffice it to say we are now very pleased to have a comprehensive proposal before you. And the bottom line to all this, why we're doing this fundamentally, there's probably 2 reasons. One, David alluded to already previously, having to do with the downtown master plan. The downtown master plan, for any of you who might have either remembered or participated in that, set the vision, set a very detailed framework for what the future of Geneva's downtown should be. And with that, and at the end of the report is true with all typical plans like this, there's a very extensive section on implementation. And in that implementation chapter, it outlines many actions and several recommendations having to do actually with zoning. Although no specific changes were made at that time, it certainly gave us the blueprint, or the city the blueprint, for what we need to do to go forward. And so we need to remember that what we're doing tonight, the genesis of these ideas are largely embedded in this 2012-2013 downtown plan. And that was our mission, if you will, the objectives that we had starting this process, is to implement that downtown plan. Should I go backwards? Sorry. So, again, reading some of the key goals that came out of that downtown plan, for which I was not a part, just to clarify that. A couple of things that I would highlight as a part of that is that the goal of the downtown plan, one, was to strengthen downtown's role as the central business district. Why is that important? Because if you're asking yourself, well, what do you do to strengthen the downtown's role as a central business district? Well, it's to strengthen existing businesses, strengthen the ability of existing businesses to be successful, strengthen the ability for property owners to improve properties, strengthen the ability for developers who are interested in making an investment here and building something new, or taking existing properties and improving them, make them more successful. And that is one key objective of what we're about in these new regulations. Two is encourage a diversity of residential housing types in and near downtown. And you will see, and if you had a chance to look at the proposals, not only did the downtown plan introduce that idea and made specific recommendations for several sites, what they call infill or potential redevelopment sites, but it was also a broader goal of the city to try to diversify the opportunities for living in and near downtown for numbers of different reasons. All right, so if we look at one of the goals, again, to reiterate the diversity of residential housing types, and we look at what the objective is, or was at that time and still is to provide housing that includes a range of housing types: single-family townhomes, multiple-family condominiums, apartments, affordable senior and affordable workforce housing. Mentioned before about the implementation matrix that was in the plan, and this detailed set, and you can't read it, and I can barely read it, detailed set, just to give you a flavor how detailed it gets, with regard to what the specific recommendations were. That led to the development of the land use plan. The land use plan is the specific guide that we used in both crafting what these new districts were going to be for downtown, and how we applied them to the physical land. So the adjustments of the boundary lines that are being proposed are a direct outcome and reflection of this agreed to, adopted land use plan back in 2012, 2013. I mentioned before the opportunity sites. I don't know, is there a pointer, David, or something? Is there a, oh, here it is. Whoop, I found it. Yeah. So I mentioned before the opportunity sites. Several parts of the plan address specific ideas or solutions to what could happen on various development sites. And when we did the original analysis, when we started this process, we also looked at some of these sites, and we asked the basic question: great plan, nice idea, it's adopted, could it be done under the existing zoning? And guess what? In many of the cases, it can't be done. And let me give you one instance. There was a site, what's called Opportunity 12. It's called the West Shoreline Multifamily Site. The purpose of this site in the plan was to provide for new multifamily and single-family attached residential in the downtown in a manner that is sensitive to established neighborhoods. The plan recommends 2 to 3 story row houses along First Street, while increasing density, height, moving east toward the river as the natural grade decreases. The zoning districts within the site, there were several. The regulations that we found that were inconsistent with the plan, we found that the zoning that was in place, what is now, actually currently, R6, medium density, 2 and 3 family residential, based on the lot area and the allowed number of dwellings that could be built, that the density, in fact, was much too low for the structures that were actually being envisioned on the in the comprehensive plan. The maximum lot coverage was too small, too restrictive, meaning there was too little land left over for the necessary parking. The height requirement, again, was too restrictive for the types of uses. And then the maximum FER, again, did not allow the plan as vision. So that's just one, and there were, I think, maybe close to a dozen or so different sites that were looked at. This is one illustration of the problem that this city has had since 2012 is a nice plan. We can't implement the dang plan because the regulations stand in our way. So that's why we're here. Existing zoning, this is to underscore the fact that we're dealing with a code that hasn't comprehensively been readdressed since 1995, although the city, through various changes over time to adjust to changing conditions, as many communities do, often amend the code over time, but no comprehensive relook, if you will, at the zoning and or zoning map had been done. So again, a very old ordinance, not reflective not only of your plan, but current development trends. So, as I said before, numbers of conflicts that were in the plan itself. The consistency between the plan and the zoning ordinance is obviously the key objective, what we're here tonight, but there's also other objectives, as I tried to allude to earlier. The notion is that within zoning, even if we adopted the land use map, fixed the boundaries, there were still provisions within the ordinance itself that were barriers for businesses, developers, property owners to achieve what was actually envisioned in the plan. So we wanted to talk about that, and I can talk a little bit more about what some of those were that were articulated to us back about 3 or 4 years ago. And the other idea was to streamline, so not only removing barriers, but if we really are serious about wanting to revitalize the downtown, are there things in terms of processes that are so restrictive as to provide barriers in effect or discouragements from developers, business owners from moving forward? So the project status, as we're before you tonight, has been alluded to, and as hopefully you've found, if not online, some hard copies available. A draft ordinance has been developed in concert with a steering committee that is, I remember, a broad-based group of business property owners, public officials, city staff, and so forth working together to take the ideas that we heard from the stakeholders that we interview and integrate those into a draft plan. And this is the project team, as I had described to you, that had worked on this. So the focus groups. Again, when we started this process, through the interview of various property and business owners, there's a number of issues that surfaced with regard to what they were telling us were the barriers for them being successful. And what the questions that we posed to the business owners were a few. It focused on how the current zoning ordinance affects operating a business, expanding a business, and or developing a new business or new property in downtown. So it was 3 parts to that question. The responses were several. Most of them are summarized in these 4 bullet points. Length of the approval process was too long. It was redundant. In many cases, multiple approvals, multiple groups had to see an application, meaning multiple delays in the timing of getting a project done, and these could be even relatively small projects. And the staff time to review and make decisions on minor changes was something that was desirable, meaning that if there's a minor change to a business, a use, a minor improvement, why have to drag someone through an extensive zoning process? Why couldn't this be something, if it complied with most of all the ordinances, was consistent with the plan, why couldn't that just simply be administratively approved, significantly foreshortening the process? And again, in many cases, owners felt that the code now was too restrictive and wanted more flexibility, and that presented itself in many different ways, one of which had to do simply with the notion of what is a permitted use versus what's a special use. And any permitted use is what we call a by right use. If you're a shoe store and you want to open a retail storefront, it's permitted. Go in, get your building permit, whatever it is, and you're on your way. In other cases, if you're a restaurant, everyone loves restaurants, wants to see restaurants, but guess what? You're a restaurant, you have to go through a special use process to open your business. There's probably a 3 or 4 month zoning process to go through, multiple groups to interview. And again, this whole notion of if it's a desirable use, we want it in our community, why are we taking people through a long protracted process only to really, after that 3 or 4 month process, approve them anyway? And so I wanted to highlight a couple of the instances where we had, I don't know if I've done it in this, see if I can find that, instances where the uses had been changed. I think it's elsewhere in the code. So those were the key objectives, the key approach, the reasons that we're doing this. Again, there was no intent to fundamentally change, if you will, what you were able to do today. If there had been some changes and you were affected that way, that's actually what we want to know about. If there were some unintended consequences of the result of these new regulations, that's what we want to hear about. We try to be as careful as we could. In fact, David and his group and in our firm had done extensive work, almost looking at every property within this area, evaluating the existing zoning, what the change was in terms of the new district. But in most cases, even though it may look a little bit scary because maybe some zoning boundaries have moved and we are these new nomenclature for new zoning districts, the whole intent was, again, to make it consistent with the plan, but not to fundamentally change what you were allowed to do today. And our hope was, in most cases, you'll find that the changes were actually proactive, meaning that they made your life better, made it easier to run a business, open a business, or to build new projects in the community consistent with the vision and the plan. So with that, I'll let David come back up and give you a little bit more detail with regard to some of the provisions of the plan.
All right, thank you, Con. So I'm going to go over some examples that are in the code now that do serve as barriers to some of those investment opportunities, and kind of address what's being proposed to address those barriers. One of the examples that Con referred to are restaurants. Right now, restaurants require a special use permit in the B3 district. Our B3 district is primarily South 3rd Street and North 3rd Street before you get to Hamilton. Geneva is known as like a dining community. We've issued 18 special use permits in that zoning district for restaurants. So that's one of the changes that we're recommending, is that restaurants are no longer a special use, they're a permitted use. You'll no longer have to go through the public hearing process to open up a restaurant on 3rd Street. Kind of a residential example, we have incentives in the zoning ordinance today to encourage front porches on homes. But almost half of the variation requests we get before the Zoning Board of Appeals are to reduce the setback in the front yard to allow a front porch, because if they add a porch, it's now too close to the street, and they can't do it without going through, again, a public hearing process. So what we're proposing to address that is to allow an encroachment into the required front yard for porches only of up to 8 feet. So overall, the draft ordinance expands administrative approvals, expedites review for minor changes in site plan review, consolidates districts with essentially the same purpose. If you're familiar with our code at all, we have the B2 district, and then we have 3 sub-districts of the B2 district, and it can be very confusing for anybody kind of looking to the zoning ordinance for guidance. Con referred to consolidating the permitted and special use lists into more general categories. Being very visual with the new ordinance. The current ordinance is very text heavy, so this adds a lot of graphics to help communicate the regulations within each district. Reducing plan review time, focusing more on form and less on density. So if we know how far we want a building to be set back and what the maximum height is, does it really matter if there's 10 or 11 units in there, and just focusing more on the form and less on the density. And then reducing the need for special approvals or PUD approvals. Streamlining the review process was a big focus. I'm going to go over each one of these examples in a little bit more detail. one thing we're proposing is to consolidate two of our bodies, the Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals, into one body to allow administrative site plan review. So instead of, again, having to go before the Plan Commission and City Council, that could be something that's reviewed by staff, and then adding some flexibility on use determinations. So that first one, consolidating the Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals, right now the Plan Commission considers most everything, amendments to the comprehensive plan, text amendments, special uses, site plan review, variations to the sign regulations, whereas the Zoning Board of Appeals only considers variations to bulk regulations, setbacks, building height, lot coverage, and then occasionally they'll hear an appeal of a decision that's been made by the zoning administrator or myself. That's pretty infrequent. So an example of why consolidation would be more efficient. It's more efficient not only for the city but for business owners. When Graham's 318, currently under construction, wanted to expand their footprint, they had to go before the Zoning Board of Appeals for a variation, Historic Preservation Commission because they're in the historic district, then Plan Commission because the expansion was large enough where it required site plan review, then to the Committee of Whole, and then City Council. So that was 5 public meetings they were required to attend, and 3 separate application fees, and that's just not really a conducive environment to have a successful business expand in the downtown. The Patent House is another example where they had to go before all 5 of those bodies for, I believe at the time it was a sign variation, historic preservation, a special use for the restaurant again, and then Committee of the Whole and City Council. On the city's end of things, you know, consolidating the boards would allow us to manage one application deadline, notice deadlines, prepare one agenda, attend one meeting, instead of going through these 5, which would free up staff time to work on other projects. And there's also a cost savings. As I mentioned, each one of those boards requires a separate application and an application fee. If it's a public hearing, the applicant's responsible for covering third-party costs. If there's somebody here taking minutes or transcripts or notices that have to be published in the paper, those are all costs of the applicant. So consolidating the 2 bodies would allow them to pay that cost once. And again, with the city, it's more efficient on those ends as well. It's not a radical idea either. Actually, a lot of communities are moving in this direction. We surveyed 50 municipalities in the region and found that 31 of them have already done that. And as we've updated that list, we found that more were considering doing the same thing. Another way we're expediting the review process is site plan review. Currently requires Plan Commission review and a recommendation of the City Council, then ultimately City Council approval. Site plan review is by right development. So if you're expanding your business by over 25% of its current footprint, that requires the site plan review, which has to go before the Plan Commission and City Council. If you've already received site plan approval and you're making a change to that approved plan set, you've got to go again back before the Plan Commission and City Council. So through our discussions with the focus groups and with the working group, we thought, you know, there's a set of standards in the zoning ordinance that you have to demonstrate you meet for site plan review. Let's let the professional staff team do a review against those standards and grant approval for by right development. If you're meeting all the restrictions of the code, we should be able to issue those permits. And then if there's any argument or on whether or not you're meeting a standard, the staff says, you know, you don't, then you can appeal that decision to the Consolidated Planning and Zoning Commission, and they can make their determination, and then it would never need to go to City Council for approval after that. Any questions on those 2 items? Okay. One kind of already addressed was use determinations. Right now, we have a painfully long list of permitted uses in each zoning district. An electronics store, a shoe store, an apparel store. And if you're not specifically listed in that district, you have to apply for a text amendment to be listed, and that requires, again, a public hearing and approval by the council. we don't have the leniency to say, yes, that's a retail use, it's okay. So the proposed ordinance has more general categories: retail uses, service uses, office uses. Some are specifically listed if they're kind of odd uses that need a little bit of a definition attached to them. But that allows us to use some discretion when allowing new uses. And if we decide that it's not a permitted use, again, the applicant has the right to appeal that decision to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Something I've heard in my 10 years here is why don't we have bed and breakfast? It's like Geneva screams for a bed and breakfast, but we don't have any. And when you look at our existing regulations, it's only permitted by a special use permit, and it must be in a residential district within 500 feet of a B2 or B3 district, which also fronts on 25, 31, or 38. So when you actually map that out, there's like 11 properties that could potentially qualify for a special use permit. Not all of them make sense for a bed and breakfast. So the proposed ordinance, we're proposing to just simply call it a special use permit in residential districts. So if you can demonstrate to the Plan Commission and City Council that you satisfy the 9 standards, you're not going to have an impact on parking in the area or create a nuisance to your neighbors. You can be granted a special use permit. And then in commercial districts where you already have, or a multifamily district where you already have more intense uses, just allow them by right. So maybe we'll get a bed and breakfast if we loosen those up. Again, kind of piggybacking on what Con referred to, there were a bunch of opportunity sites identified in the downtown plan. And these were just kind of conceptual drawings of the pattern of development we would like to see in certain areas. But when we took a detailed look at what it would take under the current regulations to allow these, there's just no way they could happen without a planned unit development or special use approval. Again, the lot area was too low for the planned density, lot coverage was too low for the planned structures, building height was too low, floor area ratio was too low. So we took that into consideration when drafting the proposed regulations. I want to talk a little bit about residential density. I know we've talked about this being more focused on the business community tonight, but I think part of the way we keep the downtown strong as a commercial area is to have people living in the downtown area. So a lot of the recommendations in the downtown plan are geared towards infill development to add some density downtown. Since we adopted the plan in 2013, on the left-hand side here, the red dots were existing structures at that time, so over about a dozen sites. You can see the red dots we had there, and then those same sites since 2013 we've added quite a few. When we look at the numbers, what used to be 15 units is now a total of 117 dwelling units. We went from 11 single-family units and 4 apartments to 30 single-family units, 57 townhomes, 8 duplexes, and 22 apartment units. Some of these have not been constructed yet, but have been approved by the council. But when we look at all those units that have been added, a total of 102 new units, 97 of those, so all but 5, required some type of special approval, planned unit development. 7 different planned unit developments were required to get that done. Those are can be long public hearings. And I think what we've learned after going through those 7 projects is what regulations are required to allow this density. Townhomes especially. We didn't have a lot of townhome products in the downtown area prior to 2013, but we've added almost 60 of them since then. And we've learned that if you're going to have a rear-loaded townhome unit, you need to reduce the street yard setback to allow that drive behind the building into the garage. And what has been approved consistently throughout those PUDs is a 10-foot setback in the front yard, provided they're rear-loaded. So kind of building that into the regulations. We've also learned that if you have a first-floor garage and 2 stories above, 35 feet is very difficult to work with. the building height, so increasing that building height and allowing some flexibility there, again, if you're a rear-loaded unit. Front-loaded, it'd stay the same, a 20-foot setback, so you have a place to park the car once you pull off the street, and then keeping the 35-foot maximum building height. You can also see on these pages kind of examples of how we're trying to illustrate the regulations so they're simpler to understand. Many of our zoning districts now, if you refer to them, they're several pages long of text. Each one of these is kind of broken down into a maximum of 2 pages, but several of them are only 1 page. Again, consolidating zoning districts where we had kind of very similar purposes. Right now, the downtown area alone consists of 18 different zoning districts. What's being proposed as drafted is down to 7 zoning districts. So again, I think that makes it simpler for developers, the business community, and the city to understand and implement. When Con said, we looked at properties very closely. I don't remember the exact number of properties, but we found 6 study areas and hundreds of different properties that we took a very detailed look at. We went property by property in these areas where we thought there could be potential conflicts, and we looked at what the existing conditions are. So what are the existing setbacks? What does the existing lot coverage approximately look to be? And then what's being proposed, and what are the issues? So we did that for 6 study areas, and I'll just kind of briefly touch on our findings in some of them. So we look at Hamilton Street South Transitional Business District. That's proposed to be rezoned to residentially scaled mixed use. We found 7 out of the 8 properties to be conforming with what's being proposed. The remaining property doesn't conform to the existing zoning regulations or the proposed. It's kind of a maxed out site. We looked at the James Street Transitional District, again to the residentially scaled mixed use. We found that 6 of the 9 properties would be conforming with what's being proposed. And while the remaining 3 are not conforming, they would have less nonconformities under the proposed zoning district than they do in the existing, so improving their status and giving them a little more flexibility. Same in some of the residential areas. Actually, in this area, in the R5 district, this is a 2- and 3-family residential district. It was based on the downtown plan, shown to go to single family, but when we looked at it, 8 out of the 11 properties would be non-conforming with what was being proposed due to lot size, coverage, lot width, and use. When we took a look at how the buildings are being used, half of them already have multiple dwelling units. So does this make sense to rezone it to a single family district? Especially when one of the objectives is to keep and encourage some density in the downtown area. An area that we found really didn't make a lot of sense was along Anderson Boulevard. There was a lot of properties that were shown going to a medium density single family district, and they're currently zoned high density. And we looked at the existing regulations and what was proposed, all but 1 property would have been non-conforming. So that's an area where we actually created a new zoning district for downtown high density single family residential. Another area was the R6 district, which is currently 2- and 3-family zoning district. Similar situation there. They were proposed to all go to single family, 108 properties. We found that 92 of them would have been non-conforming. Almost half of them already had multiple dwelling units in them that we could confirm. So we, again, recommended keeping a mixed density residential district in those areas. So I've probably said the word non-conforming 20 times in the last 60 seconds, so I apologize. What does that mean? So if you have a use today that would not be allowed under the zoning district that's being proposed, that use would become non-conforming. And if it's non-conforming, it can be continued indefinitely. No one's going to drive you out of your building. You can sell the business, you can sell the property, and that use can remain as long as it's the next use. Even if you close your doors, let's call it a shoe shop. If you close your doors and market that as one of the potential uses, you can reestablish that use. But once you change from that shoe store to a permitted use, you can't go back then to the non-conforming use. So that's how non-conforming uses are addressed in the code. A non-conforming structure would be if you say conform to setback requirements today but would not in the future. You can do ordinary repairs and maintenance on the building. You can expand the building as long as your expansion conforms to the new regulations. If the building's damaged by fire or tornado or any other act of God, you can restore the building as long as the damage doesn't exceed 50% of the total replacement cost. So if it's totally level, then the new structure would have to comply with the zoning regulations that are in place. And I guess before we get to questions, I'm sure there's a few on that aspect. I just want to remind everybody that this is the first of several community workshops. We're here to answer your questions. We'll have another one on February 12th. That'll be more of a general audience. And then if you have specific questions on your property and want to understand how you're being impacted, we'll have kind of an open house on the 26th of February where we'll just be here. You can come in and we can sit down with you and review what your concerns are. I'm also happy to do that anytime between now and then. If you can't make that public meeting, my card's on the table. Just give me a call and email and we could set up a time to do that. And then we get into the formal review by the Historic Preservation Commission. That will be a public meeting, so you'll have opportunities to ask the Planning Commission or the Historic Preservation Commission questions or express your concerns. The Planning Commission public hearing, that's where all your formal testimony will be taken. We'll have a court reporter present. If you want to provide evidence or testimony, cross-examine anybody providing testimony, you can do that. And then the recommendations of the Historic Preservation Commission and Planning Commission get forwarded to the City Council. And we're anticipating that to be in late April. So that's the tentative timeline. And with that, I guess we'll just kind of open it up for discussion and questions. Yes?
Back to if you currently have a lot that will be non-conforming with the new proposed use. If the property is destroyed, say by fire entirely,
Right.
then that non-conforming use is no longer permitted.
The use I think could be reestablished as long as the new structure then complied with the setback and lot coverage.
Okay, so setback
Right.
and lot coverage, but as far as the use, that.
Right, because the use wasn't really discontinued at that stage, right?
I don't think that summary said that accurately about the 20%. I don't think it said that.
Yeah, I think on that issue, I was really just addressing the building and not so much the use. If that were to happen, I guess didn't contemplate that. But if the use really wasn't discontinued, that could be reestablished, right?
You know, I commend your efforts to streamline the process and all these administrative things, and all that sounds wonderful. And you know, what I don't understand is taking properties along State Street and saying that these commercially zoned properties now have to be residential, or you have a non-conforming use. That doesn't seem business climate friendly as started out the talk, or the partner started out saying it helped businesses. Streamlining the process helps businesses, but taking away the permitted uses and making B2 properties some kind of residential is in no way helpful.
There's other specific areas.
Just east of the river, east of Route 25, you're proposing on the south side that those areas become multi-residential. They're all B2 right now.
That is correct. That is one area in the plan that was identified as a potential area for some multifamily development. There was actually a focus group that was done after the downtown plan. I want to say around around the same time, in 2014, where the neighborhood got together and expressed what desirable uses would be in a land use plan for that area. And that included some multifamily development and townhomes along, kind of going up the hill there. The challenge with that site being that with the slope there, it's not ideally suited for commercial development, but you could maybe get a mixed-use building on the corner if you had some dwelling units above and maybe some ground floor commercial space.
We owned it in 2014. I don't recall any involvement in such a group of forums.
Okay, I might have the date off, but I can review that with you if you like. I don't have that with me. You're talking where the jewelry shop is now? Yeah. Right. Okay.
So you're going to take my building and make it a non-conforming use. I know tonight wasn't about specific properties. I'm trying to be more general for,
Right.
and comply with what the meeting was for. You can't be here on the 26th, but I don't understand. You know, to get the streamline, this is awesome. Administratively, what you're doing is awesome, but you're on State Street, the main street in our community, and you're saying that a B2 ought to be a residential. That seems illogical.
Okay. So, Mr. Warlick, right?
Right.
Right. Okay.
When is that meeting you're having with the testified going to be recorded?
Right now, the tentative date, I think that was April 11th. But I can follow up with you once and share that information about that focus group and see if you weren't notified and why.
I mean, the whole thing becomes interesting now because the so-called historic building has just moved off of the property and now this big vacant lot. I don't know what that developer wants to do.
Right. Like I said, there was one area that was identified along State Street as potential area for some multifamily development in the plan, and that's kind of what's driving the recommended changes. I guess I'm just struggling on why you wouldn't have been notified of that at that time. So.
I have a different question though. The areas that are marked PUDs, are those planned to be or they are existing?
Those are existing planned unit developments where you see kind of the hatch marks. So if you're within an existing planned unit development and the underlying zoning district is proposed to be changed, your rights established under the planned unit development do not change. Those are retained. Do you have a question, sir?
Yes. Part of the process of combining both planning and the zoning board of appeals, right now if there's a change that a citizen wants, normally that has to be advertised like 30 days before the meeting. There's a right to appeal. I don't know what the period is in Illinois, but say 30 days. And so somebody who actually opposes that or wants input into the process has those opportunities. If it goes to administrative decisions, what kind of notification and transparency is there going to be for someone sitting in an office making decisions that affects local neighbors? How are they going to be notified of a bureaucratic decision?
Right. So the things that are proposed to be administrative are things that are actually by right development as it is, so they wouldn't need relief, so let's say setback relief or height relief on a building. The only way it could be an administrative approval of a large project like that would be as if it meets the standards established in the code. So that's what we're suggesting is right the way it is today is that if you met every regulation outlined in the ordinance for an expansion of a building over 25% or a new multifamily building that's permitted, you still have to go before the Planning Commission and City Council. And there's not a special notification required. They're public meetings, but they're not public hearings, so the notice is not sent out. So that's the area we're trying to streamline a little bit, is if we're not sending out those notices and there's really not an opportunity to notify people, why don't we streamline that process and make it an administrative review? If you do, if we're consolidating the Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals, and your application requires a public hearing, the same notification process will occur.
If there's, is there a notification process in the city of, say, somebody wants a change that normally goes through the planning commission or the board of appeals? Is there like a 200-foot radius or whatever that all the neighbors are notified? Does that also carry over?
Right. So it's actually 500 feet. I think state statute minimum is 250, but we've adopted local amendments to make it 500 feet. That notice, we send out a notice when an application is filed. So you're notified usually within a week or so of an application being filed. And then you're notified again at least 15 days prior to the public hearing on those issues. You're welcome. Yes? Right, so if you're a non-conforming structure, you can still expand the structure as long as what you're expanding complies with the new regulations. Right. Right, and ordinary repairs and maintenance and that stuff would not be an issue, right? Non-conforming provisions are really intended to kind of over time get you to the desired land use pattern. Recognizing that transitions can be difficult. You know, people have money invested in a business or a structure, and allowing that kind of cycle to occur over time before the change is kind of required. So if the building were removed or the use were to go away and a new use was established, that's the time where you would, from then on, abide by the new regulations. So, yes, Mike.
Is there some place we can look up what the new permitted uses and special uses in B2 and B3 are?
Well, so the B2 district is now being called the DCM district, and the B3 district is the DRSCM. So there, on the website, there's a table of permitted and special uses. Our website was been down all day, so I hope it's up. It's up now, and I can show you. Great. So on the project web page, at the bottom of the page, there's a link to all the related documents.
What did you say there was a recall again? B2 becomes what?
Downtown commercial mixed use, so D-CM is the D-RSCM, residentially scaled commercial mixed use. And actually, I think right now that table is buried within the ordinance. Tomorrow morning, I'll separate it out and upload it here separately, so if that's all you want to pull, it's easier to find. Yes?
How do we compare, and I look at the Hamilton corridor of what is proposed versus what exists as far as code structure requirements, height, setbacks, fire lanes?
For a specific property? Or?
Just the zoning, what's included in the zoning, what are the basic parameters today versus what's being proposed with this document? Are there any modifications to height? I see a listing
Okay.
structure?
Part of the scope of this project did not include changing fire lane widths or parking requirements. So those are not really addressed in what's being updated. But I guess your question depends on what the property is zoned and what it's being proposed. So we have done, and some of the, get my face off the screen there. Wasn't that long ago, I know. Thanks, Siobhan. You can't really see it here, but we've done that for individual properties where we've listed the current regulations, current conditions, and then the proposed regulations, so you really can see the difference. So if you have questions about your property or a specific property on what exists and what's being proposed, we can hopefully look up that sheet and share that information with you. If we did not do one for that property, we can pull one together pretty easily.
Can I address one specific issue that I think is a major issue for Hamilton? All of your downtown buildings have rear access, either through parking lots or through alleys, up and down State Street. The fire trucks can get to the rear of properties as well as to the front. Now, the Harrington Hotel, that's no problem out of the river to get to the rear of it. So I understand that that's the only property that I'm aware of. And yet on Hamilton, what was specifically approved and was built and exists is Hamilton House. No access for fire or emergency vehicles to get to the rear of the property. You're proposing, and now seems to me to be the time, as part of the zoning, that you should be having the fire department review these plans before it looks to me that it doesn't go to public safety until after you've already approved it. I would have hoped that fire and public safety would have already looked at these plans, but as you're increasing the density up and down Hamilton, you're permitting much greater lot usage in the long term. What are you doing to address safety, fire safety, safety for the buildings that are on either side of it, buildings that are to the rear of it? I didn't find anything that addressed that, and that bothered me.
So the Hamilton House, that was constructed under the old B2 zoning district, which allowed for 100% lot coverage, I think 45 feet of building height, no setbacks. So that building does stick out like it more than others on Hamilton Street. And it was actually, I think, part of the impetus for the transitional zoning districts that we have now, to make sure that we don't have more of those along Hamilton Street. What's being proposed with this update is to kind of consolidate those transitional districts into what we're calling the residentially scaled commercial district. So not 45 feet tall, not 100% lot coverage and 0 foot building setbacks. But to answer your question on the review end of things, with a new commercial structure, public safety is definitely involved in our staff review. Whether that's an administrative approval or not, they are involved.
That's for the construction, but shouldn't in your master plan, as properties get developed, some access be set aside so that eventually you're going to have an easement, you're going to effectively create an alley for those properties over time. But shouldn't that be part of your master moving forward as properties get rebuilt, that you have that access for public safety? Something that I think you should think about.
Okay. I think the intention on Hamilton, especially the north side, is to keep it in that kind of residential scale. So, because it is a transitional district to residential properties to the north, so not to encourage higher density development where we are going to need an alleyway to access them properly. So I think it's kind of self-policing that way. And if we were to review a project that,
If you're speaking to the residential, and I know that's the next meeting predominantly, and not so much here, but you're proposing up to 6 units on Dayton. That's hardly low density. You're talking about maximum density on Dayton, on residential, on the properties immediately behind him. And so you're going to be having, again, no way of getting around the house to get a fire truck to fight a fire, because you're going to be having, again, somebody that's going to be having front-loaded, 6-foot side yard. You're not going to get a vehicle down through there. Maybe a long fire hose, somebody run down the side of the house, but it's pretty.
I think I understand the concern, but
That density that you're creating in that corridor, the safety issue is not being adequately built in on the front end. It should be on the front end,
Okay.
all the way through.
understood.
Enough of my comments.
Dave?
Dave, to help with your comment, I think you might be mixing building code requirements with zoning requirements. And there is building code requirements that even though you may meet the use of zoning code, you still have to be building code. Building code, going through, as an example, the Harrington, there's other alternatives besides the second means of egress or access to a building. There's communication systems that you can put into the building that the fire department next to. There's external sprinkler systems on structures that allow for variation from those specific codes. So what I'm hearing you ask, to me, it's more a building code question versus a zoning code question. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to say, is that the fire department is involved in the review of all new structures against the established building code, life safety codes, and making sure that proper access is there, proper ingress egress from the building is there, proper fire suppression, alarm paneling.
When you're addressing it on an individual building by building, individual property, you don't have the opportunity to address the entire block. Zoning here gives you that opportunity to address the entire corridor, 6 blocks long. You can address it and say, hey, wait a minute, our long-term plan, we should set back a minimum of 10 feet that can be eventually connected with other properties, and so that at some point in time, there is access, but you can't do it on an individual building by building approval process because it never gets connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I understand the concern.
I'm not a building code expert or anything, I know an alley was required, as a strip center, and it was built, at the corner of Fifth and
Okay.
what, 4 years ago, when it was built, probably 30 years ago. And at one time, they had a nice sign there that said fire lane. That sign has disappeared, but it still has fire access, and as it should.
Right. Any other questions? Con?
Maybe
Yeah.
with some light on that, just looking at the proposed zoning, which are the colors on this map. All those properties. So there's no use of those parcels on the north side. It will still remain single family, and the proposed.
It's mixed high density, the way I'm reading it. It's not, and so high density,
The color in yellow here?
Yeah. He's He's saying the south side of Peyton. This section.
South side of Peyton.
That's apartments and condos.
That's the problem.
High density apartments and condos.
Single family, 2-family, 3-family, and then potentially townhomes.
High density apartments and condos.
That would be the multifamily district,
Multifamily apartments.
right? But that's not in this area. Right.
Attached, single-family dwelling up to 6 units. That's the way I'm reading Peyton, it's permitted.
Right, and on the south side, that could be a permitted use.
That's pretty high density for a historic district, old houses.
Other comments or questions? Yes.
So with the proposed zoning changes, how does that affect, say, property on Hamilton that currently is in the historic district? Does that change anything with the historic zoning?
It doesn't change anything with the historic district. The historic district overlay will still be in place. So areas that might be proposed or have potential for higher density, you still have the protection of the historic district in place. So you're not going to see historic structures suddenly demolished just to accommodate the new density. To demolish a historic structure, you need to have a public hearing before the Historic Preservation Commission and really make a case as to why that building should be demolished.
But huge additions to existing historic structures are permitted.
Within the confines of the zoning ordinance.
As long as you meet the setback on the front and the sides and the height, you can put a huge addition.
Right. That's correct. Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, this all sounds good. Somewhat faster, all that kind of stuff. But can you define where you see areas where maybe more restrictive? I mean, for a business owner, that's my biggest issue is where else are you restricted?
Okay. I guess that kind of, I think overall, as far as processes go, we are less restrictive, more streamlined, more flexible on use determinations, all of those things that we covered. I think in areas where we could potentially be more restrictive would be more on a property by property basis. So let's say if you were in the B2 district today, which is the 100% lot coverage, 0 setbacks, and you were proposed to go to the more residentially scaled commercial, that might be more restrictive in terms of setbacks, lot coverage, building height.
So you mentioned you wanted to work that.
Yeah, actually, if you don't mind, Scott. I met with Mr. Crow last week. He's one of those areas. Yes, we've got, that's right here, right? 5th Street. Currently in the B2 district, and then proposed to go into that residentially scaled commercial mixed use. I think the reason we're drawing the line there, not just to make a neat line kind of halfway through the block, but the office is in a historic home that's been converted to a commercial use and is set back from the street, and kind of maintaining that character as you transition to the residential areas to the south. Right, so that was another property that was identified as kind of a down zoning, I guess, there. You've got a few more on the north side of 5th Street. Sorry? And Mr. Warlick's office, right? Anderson. Yes, so Anderson, we've got the B2 zoning district there, where you have Altiro's and the karate place. That's proposed to go to the residentially scaled commercial district as well, given its proximity to the residential neighborhood and not allowing.
What negative impact will have on this property?
As far as the uses go, the uses can stay. The buildings can stay indefinitely. If they are expanded, they have to conform with the new regulations. Those sites are pretty much built out as it is, so this is more about if the site were to redevelop, how we would want that new development to take place.
Current B2 allows you to use more of the property than the new setbacks, correct?
It would if you could park it and all of that. But as it sits today, that property is 100% lot coverage between the buildings and the parking lot. And if you were to expand the building, you'd have to provide more parking. So I think it would be, I don't think there's much development potential there today without some change. Other questions or concerns? Yes.
Since the plan is 2014 that was adopted, when you were going through it as a staff and consultant, did you see anything that stood out as the zoning that was like, oh, maybe that doesn't work anymore, or is it pretty much everything that is in that plan that was part of it?
It's not. That's where we started. The plan was adopted in 2012, and then it was amended about a year later in some areas by the City Council. And then we didn't really engage TESCA until 2014 through a grant application, and that's part of why it kind of took some time, is we only got so far with that grant money. But to answer the question, there were several areas where, I touched on them briefly earlier, we just started with exactly what was in the plan, and then as we thought that there might be high potential for conflict there, we took a closer look at it. Those areas really didn't make sense to change the zoning. Some areas that, like this R6 area, is all 2 and 3 family zoning now and was proposed to go to single family, and we took a closer look at that area. We found that there were a lot of existing 2 and 3 family buildings in that zoning district, and we want to keep density close to the downtown area, so why change the zoning to single family? And we kept it as a mixed density residential district.
You're actually increasing. You're not keeping. You're permit for use.
We've added the potential for townhomes in that district.
When we look, I think it's important when we look at these transitional areas where the density is increasing, I think we need to keep in mind that there are other standards that apply, and it doesn't mean that you have a lot, that the district is going to be able to get 4 units or 6 units on that lot. The district where we're doing, it's the, what's the description again? The medium density?
Yeah,
Or the high density?
the MHR district.
When you look at the standards for mixed high, you have to have a minimum lot area of 6,500 square feet. The minimum lot area per unit has to be 3,250 square feet. So even if you had a lot of 6,500, the best you can get is 2 dwelling units on that lot. So the point is, the only way you're going to get upwards of 2 or 4 or 6 or whatever the number is, there would have to be a significant consolidation of properties. If someone would have to apply more than one lot to get anywhere near the densities that would be quote, permitted in that district. So, what's that? Yeah, the height remains 35, so that would be consistent with concern is there's an impression that, overnight this is going to change into, all townhomes or something. That's not the case unless the developer and/or homeowners were willing to sell their homes and allow a developer to come in. The city still would have control over the review of that project, most likely through.
Especially if it involved the demolition of historic structures.
Right.
Again, you'd really have to demonstrate on why those structures need to be demolished. I think we have seen a number of townhomes in the downtown area. If you look, at Park Place up by Wheeler Park, or the new townhomes being built across the street, where we did have some homes demolished and townhomes put in their place. Those are outside of the historic district. So Stevens Street is the northern boundary line of the historic district, and those so those homes were not protected by the historic district. I don't know that all of them needed to, should have been historic or not. So that's where we've seen some of those instances where we've had some demolitions and new larger densities fill in. But I think that without some serious consolidation and some serious demonstration on why these historic structures need to be removed, I don't think the threat is overwhelming. Yes.
Is there any, like infill sites, is there any scale that has to do with like the houses or the property there next door? So I know you mentioned something about, the front loaded, rear loaded, setback from the front, 35 feet might not be tall enough if you have a garage in the bottom. Does it ever take into account what's on each side of it, so you don't have this, huge structure? It's going to be,
Right.
more low level. I've seen some ordinances do that before.
Right, so we have built into the single-family districts some setback averaging requirements. So if a new infill house is going in between two existing houses, you have to take the average setback of those adjoining houses, and that's where you line up your house. Floor area is controlled based on the size of the lot. So the larger a lot you have, the larger house you can have. If you have a smaller lot, you can't build a McMansion on it. It should be in scale with the size of the property. So we do have some of those protections in place in the single family district, and those are carryovers from the existing ordinance. In the mixed density areas, you still have the layer of review by the Historic Preservation Commission, and if they are reviewing a new structure, obviously they're not preserving anything, but what they are looking at is compatibility with the context of the neighborhood. So scale, setbacks, obstruction of views of other historic structures in the area. So I think those things are addressed through that level of review in those areas. If if we have more questions after this evening, call me, email me, come to the next workshop. Happy to meet or have a phone call with anybody anytime, so don't feel like you have to get all your questions out tonight. But if there are more, we have the room, so happy to entertain them.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.